Hello and welcome to episode 116 of the Wisdom from the Akashic podcast. My name is Suzie. I am your host and I'm an Akashic Records teacher and practitioner. Before I get into today's conversation, this is just a quick reminder that my next level 1 starts on the 21st of April. I will pop a link into the show notes with an episode that I did on level 1. So if you're interested in learning more about that class and what it can help you with, this is going to be the last level 1 that I do before the autumn time. It's especially important if you are looking to attend the Akashic Abundance class this year, which is going to take place in May, that if you haven't already done level 1, this is the only opportunity to do this with me live before we do Akashic Abundance in May. You can, of course, always have access to a self-study portal if you want to do level 1 in your own time. You just drop me an email about that one. But this is the last live level 1 training until autumn 2026, and I, of course, would love to see you there. Today, we are going to talk a little bit about this conversation that tends to rear its head every couple of years within the spiritual community about whether there are people walking around who are soulless or who are NPCs. I think I first came across this idea or this concept that there are people who are soulless or NPCs back in 2019, I believe it was. I think that's the first time I saw it. And I always try to keep a very open mind. I always want to take things in, see if they resonate, but also do some research in respect of where these ideas come from to help me feel into what I believe to be true in these types of circumstances. What I want to share with you today is not telling you what to think in any way, shape, or form. I hope that you know by now that I provide this information, I provide these perspectives to help you think for yourselves, to help you feel into, does this resonate with me? That's always my aim with this type of things. But my hope is that by giving you this information, it's going to broaden the conversation for you a little bit so you can feel into what your perspective is and what the esoteric and occult foundations are for this. So this is very much my opinion. I'll explain why this is my opinion, and please take it and work with it. The first thing we need to do is differentiate between soulless beings and soulless humans. Now, I'm going to cover soulless beings in a future podcast episode, which is going to be about egregores, tulpas, pendulums, and that's going to be next week's episode. So I'm going to park that conversation for now, understand that there can be beings, especially in the astral plane, that would be considered soulless. That's a high-level conversation, and we'll talk about it in depth in the podcast next week. But what I'm referring to today is, are there soulless humans? So are there human beings walking around who are NPCs? Now, human beings and the human form is divine. Human beings are part of what's called the spiritual hierarchies. And whichever esoteric and spiritual traditions you look at, there is a thing called the spiritual hierarchies. They're going to have different names and different structures, but human beings are always in there. We need to understand why there is this belief that there are humans walking around without souls. So people believing that there are people who are NPCs, and I want to give my perspective as to why I believe that is, where this idea comes from. So for the record, I do not believe that there are people who are NPCs or people who are walking around without souls, and I'll get into the why I don't believe that as we go through this podcast episode. But first of all, I want to share with you what I learned when I first heard this concept in respect of where this idea even comes from and where there is this understanding that there are people who are walking around without souls. And the two main reference points that I could find were some work by Blavatsky and Dolores canon. So I'll take each of these in turn. When people were referring to Blavatsky's work, they were referring specifically to the second volume of The Secret Doctrine. And the second volume of The Secret Doctrine is a very detailed look at Anthropogenesis. And Anthropogenesis is how the human form came to be, essentially. So it's looking at, through the lens of esoteric studies, how the human being comes to be. Volume 1 of The Secret Doctrine, for those of you who haven't come across it, is cosmogenesis or cosmology, and that's looking at how the solar system and Earth and the different planets come into being and how they interact as well. So the secret doctrine is quite complex, it's quite detailed, it's definitely works that are to be studied, but these are the primary works of Blavatsky that gets referenced. There is also a volume 3 of The Secret Doctrine, but my understanding is that volume 3 is published after she dies, so it's a collection of her works, but volumes 1 and 2 were definitely written and published whilst Blavatsky was alive. So in the second volume of The Secret Doctrine, which is talking about anthropogenesis and how the human form comes into being, Blavatsky talks about this thing called root races, and what she's talking about when she references root races is different levels of souls coming into evolution, coming into different incarnations at different stages of evolution. She's not talking about race in the way that we know it today. When she's referring to people being soulless, what she's referring to here, as far as I can understand it, is actually to do with a specific stage of evolution of the human form, which, as I said, is very detailed in this work. And it's this point at which human beings gain the spark of intelligence or the higher mind or manas. So there's this period during the evolution of the human form at which this occurs. This is a concept that we talk about quite a lot in the membership because we look at not only cosmology and how Earth comes into being, but the different stages that humans have been through to getting to the point that we are now in our material physical form. So I appreciate this is quite a complex idea, but I want you to understand that when this is referenced in Blavatsky's work, it's all to do with specific stage of evolution that we've been through as humans to get to the point that we are now. She was not talking about the fact that there were people walking around without souls. The second point of reference is, of course, Dolores Cannon. And this is when she was talking about background or backdrop people. And this was information that she received through QHHT sessions that she was taking. So my understanding is that Dolores Cannon was recording the readings that she was doing, and then lots of her books, I'm sure there are some that aren't this way, but lots of her books are essentially transcripts of the readings that she has done. So what we have to bear in mind when we're looking at the information brought through by Dolores Cannon and through the clients who were under hypnosis in QHHT is that they are trying to give some information and they don't necessarily have esoteric or occult training or studies. They haven't necessarily looked into how a soul truly develops. So that has to be borne in mind when we're looking at where this idea comes from. We have to remember Earth is a fascinating school. When people come into incarnations on Earth specifically, there is a whole host of different levels of consciousness and different levels of soul evolution that humans can have. You can be sat on a train and on one side of you, you can have somebody who's in a very contracted state of consciousness, who maybe is at the very first level of the soul evolution. And on the other side of you, there can be someone who's an enlightened master. This is one of the amazing things about Earth, that humans can come in at all of these different levels, experience things on Earth to help their soul evolve. It's one of the things that makes Earth a very sought after location for souls looking for physical incarnation. Because people are at different levels of soul development when they come into an Earth incarnation, it can appear, if you look from the outside, that certain people are not interested in the development of their soul and their evolution of their soul. They're not having a spiritual awakening. They have zero interest in spiritual realms. They may deny its existence completely, and they may just be focusing solely on material reality. And that's all features of earlier stages of soul development, and that's completely normal. That doesn't mean that because that person is not interested, is not having a spiritual awakening, is not at that stage of soul development, that they don't have a soul. It can just be that they are at a different stage. They are maybe working at something else for the physical incarnation. So whatever lens you want to work with, so whether it's looking at levels of consciousness, looking at stages of soul development, all spiritual and esoteric traditions, as far as I can see, talk about this in depth. They talk about the fact that there are these different stages, these different levels that a soul is going to go through. And this is something I'm going to cover in depth in the membership this year. If you want to sign up for that, pop a link into the show notes. But we're going to get into this in quite some detail because it's very important to have an understanding of this if you're going to be operating in the world and obviously working with other people and having much more kindness and compassion for other people. So if we take this understanding that there are very little in the way of teachings that are telling us that people are soulless or NPCs, it's taken out of context as far as Blavatsky is concerned, and what I can see with Dolores canon stuff, I think it's probably just a lack of esoteric understanding or education. Why is this an important conversation to have? So why is it important to really take this away and mull it through your mind? There's a couple of reasons. So number one is any time you are judging someone and where they're at on their spiritual journey, your ego is in control. This is one of the many ways that spiritual ego shows up, where people are pointing fingers at people and saying, you're not as high vibe as me, you're too low vibe, you don't have a soul. This is all just spiritual ego. So if you find yourself doing this, completely normal. It's one of the activities that Bob loves to do. And turn the focus back on yourself and your own development. It's not your job to know where someone is at on their spiritual journey unless you're working with them in a one-to-one capacity. You don't know what their soul wants to experience in this life unless perhaps you're doing an Akashic reading for them. But most of the time, where someone is at on their own spiritual journey is none of your business. Your job is to focus on your soul and your soul's evolution. And anytime you're going into judgment, it's ego. The second reason that this is an important conversation to have, and this is actually the most important point, is saying that people don't have souls and you deciding that people don't have souls is very dehumanizing. And anything that is dehumanizing, anything that is less than, not human, is dangerous. Viewing anyone as less than human is literally the opposite of truth, capital T truth, that is revealed to you throughout your spiritual journey. And that is that humans are divine, that each human is an individualized fractal of source consciousness, and that we are all interconnected. Ultimately, we are all one. So rather than dehumanizing people, look to see if you can see the divinity within every single person you meet. Ram Dass used to say, everyone he meets is God in drag. So try to, if you find yourself shifting into that judgment or deciding that you're going to say somebody is less than, try to shift to, can I see the divinity in each of these individuals that I meet? The third reason this is quite problematic is, of course, it enhances this illusion of separation. Any teaching that you come across or any claim that you come across on the internet that says it's spiritual and then promotes separation and division are false light teachings. And I'll pop a link into the show notes of an episode that I did on false light. It's quite detailed and it'll help you navigate your way through the online space. Absolutely educate yourself on the soul and how it develops and different levels of consciousness and all of that stuff. It's fascinating, I promise. And as I said, I'm going to cover it in the membership this year. But do that before you go around saying that people are NPCs or people have no souls. Really understand the complexity and the divinity of the human form before you start saying these things. I know from my work in the Akashic Records that human incarnations are highly sought after. Souls absolutely love to come to experience Earth, and every single human incarnation is divine and precious. That's my take, that's my perspective, that's my opinion. I ask that you take this away, you feel into it, you think into it, and perhaps do a little bit of studies around these different levels so that rather than saying somebody doesn't have a soul, you can perhaps consider maybe they're just in one of those earlier stages of development. And if they're in my life, how can I help them where they are at? I hope this has given you some food for thought, and I will, of course, see you next week for the next episode.